Hello, and welcome to Creepy Raindrops. Before you drift off to sleep, let me tell you a story that will help you relax and fall into a deep, peaceful slumber. Sit or lie down comfortably, and let the world around you slowly fade away. Tonight I will take you on a journey through the woods, where the air is cool and the shadows of the trees stretch long. As you listen, let your mind relax, your body feel heavy, and all the noise in your head gradually fade away. Before we begin, I'd like to know, which city are you listening to this story from? And what time is it there? The Haunting of Route 66, a California road trip nightmare. It was the summer of 1998, and my friends and I were eager to embark on a long-anticipated road trip across the United States. We had all heard the legends and stories that surrounded the iconic Route 66, the main street of America, which stretched from Chicago to Santa Monica, California. As we packed our bags and prepared for the adventure of a lifetime, none of us anticipated the dark and unsettling experiences that awaited us. The idea of driving along Route 66 had come about one night when we were sitting around a campfire, swapping stories of famous haunted places across the country. We had all heard rumors of eerie happenings along the highway, and with each passing year, the myths seemed to grow. From abandoned motels that seemed to be stuck in time to ghostly figures that wandered the roads, it was clear that Route 66 had an aura of mystery and danger. But what intrigued us the most were the stories of travelers who claimed they had experienced strange phenomena, ones that couldn't easily be explained. We were a group of 5 friends: Mark, the ever-curious and adventurous one; Jessica, our skeptic who always questioned the paranormal; Sam, the quiet but intense storyteller; Sarah, the logical and level-headed planner; and myself, Tom, the one who believed that sometimes the most chilling things in life couldn't be explained by science alone. The road trip had been months in the making, and we had all agreed that this journey would be the ultimate adventure. We even rented an old van, one that had the perfect mix of vintage charm and practicality. Our journey started in the heart of the Midwest, but it wasn't until we reached the California border that things began to feel off. The desert heat, combined with the isolation of the vast stretches of land, made everything feel surreal. It was around midnight when we reached one of the most infamous parts of Route 66, an area near the small town of Amboy. The road was long, straight, and barren, stretching endlessly into the darkness. Only the occasional flicker of a distant light from an old gas station or abandoned roadside diner broke the silence. We had heard the stories of this stretch of highway. Some locals claimed that it was haunted by the spirits of travelers who had met untimely deaths along the road. There were tales of ghostly figures hitchhiking, only to vanish into thin air once you offered them a ride. Others spoke of the ghost car that would tail vehicles, appearing to be just a few feet behind you, only to disappear when you looked in the rearview mirror. As we drove further into the night, the weight of the stories seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog. Mark, who had been driving, kept glancing nervously at the rearview mirror, as if expecting something to appear. "You guys ever hear about the ghost car?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jessica, ever the skeptic, rolled her eyes. "It's just a myth, Mark. People love making up these stories to add mystery to an otherwise boring stretch of road. But something about the stillness of the desert, the lack of other cars on the road, and the oppressive darkness made her words sound hollow. As we continued driving, we couldn't help but feel that we were being watched. Around 1:30 a.m., we pulled over to the side of the road to stretch our legs and grab some snacks from the van. There wasn't a soul in sight, just the occasional howl of wind across the barren landscape. But that's when we first noticed something strange. In the distance, near the remnants of an old gas station, We saw what appeared to be a figure standing by the roadside. At first, we thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe a mirage caused by the desert heat. Sam, who had been silent for most of the trip, spoke up. "That doesn't look right," he said, his voice tinged with unease. We all turned to look. The figure was standing motionless, dressed in a faded coat, despite the oppressive heat. It was too far to make out any clear details, but there was something unsettling about it. The stillness of the figure made it seem unnatural, like it wasn't just a person but something else entirely. "Maybe it's just someone stranded," Sarah suggested, always the practical one. "We should help them," but before anyone could respond, the figure vanished. It wasn't like they walked away or disappeared behind a building. One moment it was there, and the next, it was gone, as if swallowed by the night. We all stood frozen, staring at the empty stretch of road. "I don't like this," Mark muttered, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "Let's just get back in the van." We piled back into the van, the tension palpable. The engine roared to life, and Mark sped down the highway, eager to put distance between us and the strange figure. But that's when the real horror began. It started innocently enough. We continued driving through the dark, empty road, the hum of the van's engine filling the silence. Then, out of nowhere, we heard a faint sound from the back of the van, a light tapping on the metal. It was so quiet at first that we all thought it was just the wind or a rock hitting the underside of the vehicle. But as the tapping grew louder and more insistent, we couldn't ignore it. "What the hell is that?" Jessica asked, her voice trembling. Mark glanced in the rearview mirror. "There's nothing behind us," he said, his voice barely audible. The tapping grew louder, now accompanied by the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate. We all turned to look at the back of the van, but there was nothing there. The van was empty, and yet the sounds continued, as if something or someone was walking around in the back of the vehicle. Then, without warning, the van's headlights flickered, casting strange shadows across the barren desert landscape. For a brief moment, we all saw what looked like a figure standing just outside the van, its face obscured by the dim light. "That's it," Sam said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to get off this road. Now." Mark didn't need any further encouragement. He slammed his foot on the accelerator and we sped off, racing down the highway at an alarming speed. But no matter how fast we went, the strange presence seemed to follow us, like an invisible force trailing behind. As we neared the town of San Bernardino, we noticed that the air had grown heavy, the atmosphere thick with an unsettling energy. Mark pulled into a gas station, desperate for a moment to collect his thoughts. The station was old, its neon sign flickering sporadically. There was a lone attendant inside, but the place felt completely deserted. We piled out of the van, each of us silently wondering what had just happened. "I don't think I can do this anymore," Jessica said, her voice shaking. That wasn't normal. That was something else. None of us could argue with her. We were all shaken, but it wasn't until later that we realized just how strange and terrifying our encounter had been. As we refueled the van, the attendant gave us a strange look, as if he knew something we didn't. "Be careful out there," he warned. "Route 66 has a way of playing tricks on people. You never know who or what you'll meet out there." We didn't stay long. As we left the gas station, the figure from the roadside, the tapping in the van, and the eerie presence that had followed us still haunted our thoughts. We decided to take a detour, avoiding the rest of Route 66 and the dark stretch of highway that had nearly become our tomb. The rest of our trip went without incident, but the memory of that night stayed with us. We couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been out there on Route 66 wasn't just a myth, it was real. And it still lurked in the dark corners of the highway, waiting for the next unsuspecting traveler to come along. To this day, whenever I hear stories about Route 66, I can't help but shiver. The highway may seem like a relic of the past, a nostalgic route for road trippers and tourists, but there's something darker beneath its surface, something that can't be explained by logic or science. something that is still waiting for its next victim. And I'll never forget that night when Route 66 became more than just a road trip. It became a nightmare.
Lost in the California desert. A road trip gone wrong. It was meant to be the perfect California road trip. The plan was simple: drive through the scenic desert landscapes, visit some quirky small towns, and catch the beautiful sunset in Joshua Tree National Park. But by the time the sun had set on our adventure, none of us could have imagined how wrong things would go. My name is Adam, and I was traveling with my two friends, Sarah and Lucas. We had been planning this trip for months, excited to escape the grind of city life for a while. The journey started off on a high note. We were full of energy as we left Los Angeles, singing along to our favorite songs and laughing over stories from the past. Our first stop was supposed to be in the town of Indio for some authentic desert food and a rest, but we were so swept up in the excitement that we decided to push through to a more remote part of the desert. Lucas, who was always the adventure seeker, had found a hiking trail in the southern part of the California desert. It was supposed to be a simple hike that would take us through some of the most beautiful, untouched landscapes, far away from the crowds. We were all eager to experience the serenity of the desert, away from the noise of the city. As we continued our drive, the landscape began to change. The dense cityscape of Los Angeles faded behind us, replaced by miles of open road and vast, barren land. The sun was high in the sky, casting its bright rays across the desert, which seemed endless. The isolation began to feel eerie, but we brushed off any lingering sense of discomfort. By mid-afternoon, we reached the trailhead. There was an old sign that marked the start of the hike, faded by years of harsh desert winds, but still legible. It was a marked trail, popular with experienced hikers, or so we thought. The air felt warm but not unbearable, and the excitement we all felt pushed any lingering doubts out of our minds. We started walking down the trail, chatting and enjoying the breathtaking desert views. But as we ventured deeper, the landscape changed again. The cacti and dry shrubs turned into jagged rock formations, and the silence around us grew more profound. The air was still, and even the faintest sound seemed amplified. Our footsteps crunching on the gravel, the occasional gust of wind, and the distant hum of an airplane high above. An hour into the hike, we came to a clearing, where we decided to take a break. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows on the rocky ground. We pulled out our water bottles, sat down on the warm rocks, and soaked in the stunning view. But as we sat there, a strange sense of unease began to settle over me. It was subtle at first, a nagging feeling that we weren't alone. I glanced around at my friends, but they seemed completely at ease, lost in their own thoughts. Sarah was staring at the sky, lost in the beauty of the moment, while Lucas was scrolling through his phone, likely trying to find the best route to the next part of the trail. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just the isolation and the vastness of the desert playing tricks on my mind. But then something caught my eye. Across the clearing, barely visible against the rocks, there was a figure standing in the distance. It was hard to make out any details, but the figure looked almost out of place. It didn't belong in the desert. It stood motionless, barely moving, and the faint, flickering movement in the distance made it seem like it was watching us. I rubbed my eyes, convinced that it was just a trick of the light or my imagination, but when I looked again, the figure was still there. It hadn't moved. "Hey, do you guys see that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Sarah looked up and squinted. "See what?" "That figure," I said, pointing toward the distant rocks. Lucas followed my gaze and shook his head. "It's probably just a rock formation or a cactus. You're seeing things, man." I felt a chill run through me, but I didn't press the issue. Maybe I was seeing things, maybe it was just my mind playing tricks. We decided to get moving again, and I quickly pushed the odd feeling aside. But the closer we got to the next part of the trail, the more uneasy I became. That figure, though still far away, seemed to be following us, always lingering in the distance, never moving forward, but always visible in the corner of my eye. The sun began to set, painting the sky in fiery oranges and reds. It was a beautiful sight, but the sinking sun brought with it a sense of foreboding. We hadn't planned to stay in the desert overnight, but as the hours passed, we found ourselves in a more remote part of the trail. The landscape had become even more desolate, and we had long since lost sight of the trail markers that were supposed to guide us back. "Okay, this is weird," Sarah said, breaking the silence. "We should have seen the trailhead by now." "I think we're lost," Lucas admitted, his voice tense. "We've been off track for a while." I felt a surge of panic rising in my chest. How did we miss it? We should have been able to see the car by now. We retraced our steps, but the trail seemed different, as if it had shifted in some strange, unexplainable way. Every turn we took led us deeper into the labyrinth of rocks and dry earth. The sky was now a deep purple, and the first stars began to twinkle above us. The vastness of the desert was becoming more overwhelming, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then it happened. The figure appeared again. This time it was closer. I could make out a faint outline of a person, standing motionless just beyond the rocks. I froze in place, my heart pounding in my chest. "Guys," I whispered, pointing. "It's him again." Sarah and Lucas both turned, but by the time they looked, the figure had disappeared. "I'm done," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "This is crazy. We need to get out of here now." We all agreed. Panic was setting in, and our once leisurely hike had turned into a desperate search for the trailhead. We pushed on, but no matter which way we turned, nothing looked familiar. The desert had swallowed us whole, and we were trapped in its vast emptiness. The temperature began to drop quickly, and our water supply was running low. The stars above were bright, but they offered no comfort, only the cruel reminder that we were completely alone in this desolate place. Our phones had no service, and as the darkness deepened, the once beautiful desert landscape had become something sinister, a vast, unforgiving expanse that seemed to mock us with its silence. Just as we were about to give up, we saw something in the distance. Dim lights, flickering like a mirage. It was the last thing we expected to see. Desperate and exhausted, we began to walk toward the lights, praying they were real. As we drew closer, the lights became clearer. It was a small, dilapidated building, barely visible against the dark desert. There was an old truck parked outside, and a faded sign that read Desert Lodge. It seemed too strange to be true. But with no other option, we walked up to the door and knocked. An older man, his face weathered by years of desert living, answered the door. His eyes were wide with surprise when he saw us. "Y'all lost or something?" he asked, his voice gravelly. We nodded, too exhausted to speak. "You'd better come inside," he said, stepping aside to let us in. "This desert has a way of playing tricks on people. You wouldn't be the first to get lost out here." As we sat inside, sipping the warm water he offered us, the old man told us stories of travelers who had disappeared into the desert, never to be seen again. He explained how the landscape could shift, how the desert seemed to have a mind of its own, disorienting those who ventured too far. By the time we left the lodge the next morning, the desert was just as beautiful and haunting as ever. We made our way back to the trailhead, and the familiar landscape seemed like a dream, as though the night had been a strange illusion. We never spoke much about what happened that night, but the memory stayed with us. The desert had shown us a side we weren't prepared for, a reminder of how easy it is to become lost in its vastness. and how the California desert holds more than just beauty. It holds mysteries that are best left untouched. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that we weren't the only ones out there. Something or someone was watching us that night, waiting for the next lost soul to wander too far. The Shadow on the Highway, true California road trip horror. It was a warm July evening when my friends and I decided to take a road trip down the Pacific Coast Highway. We were all eager to escape the monotony of our lives in the city and experience the freedom that only a long drive through California's breathtaking coastline could offer. Our plan was simple. Drive from San Francisco to Los Angeles, stopping along the way at the best viewpoints, quaint towns, and hidden gems that the coast had to offer. We were in our mid-20s, full of excitement, and ready for the adventure. The four of us were packed into my old Subaru, a car that had seen better days, but was still reliable enough for a weekend getaway. There was me, James, the one who always planned the trips. Sarah, my girlfriend, who was the practical one, always worrying about the details. Mark, our friend with a knack for making everything sound like an epic adventure. And Laura, who was always up for anything, no questions asked. We had been driving for hours, the ocean breeze and the sound of the waves crashing against the cliffs accompanying us as we navigated the winding road. The Pacific Coast Highway, or PCH as the locals called it, had long been a dream drive for us. The beauty of the landscape, with its jagged cliffs and sweeping ocean views, was enough to make anyone forget the stresses of daily life. The sun had begun to set, casting the sky in hues of orange and pink, creating a serene atmosphere that seemed to promise the perfect end to a perfect day. But as the sky darkened and the evening settled in, the mood shifted. The peaceful beauty of the coast slowly turned into something else, something unsettling. We had been driving along a stretch of road near Big Sur, a notoriously remote and rugged area, when we first noticed it. It started as a strange shadow in the distance. First, it was hard to make out. The night had fallen quickly, and the only source of light was the fading glow of the sun on the horizon. But as we drove closer, we saw it more clearly. A tall, dark figure standing at the edge of the road. It was positioned in the shadow of a large rock formation, barely visible against the darkening landscape. "Is someone out there?" Mark asked, leaning forward in his seat, his voice filled with curiosity. I squinted into the dark. "It looks like it. Probably a hitchhiker or something." We had all heard about the occasional hitchhiker along the coast, a common sight in the more remote areas of California, but this felt different. The figure was standing unervingly still, almost motionless, as if it was waiting for something or someone. As we got closer, I could see more clearly that the figure was wearing a long coat, despite the warm summer night, and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured its face. "Do you think we should stop?" Laura asked, glancing nervously at me. "Maybe they need help." Sarah, who had always been the most cautious of the group, furrowed her brow. "I don't know, guys. It doesn't feel right. It's late, and we're in the middle of nowhere. Why is someone out here alone?" I felt a wave of uncertainty wash over me. There was something strange about the figure, something that didn't sit well. The way it stood so perfectly still, like it wasn't even part of the world around it, gave me an eerie feeling. Still, I couldn't resist the urge to pull over. "We can't just leave someone stranded out here," I said, trying to sound confident. "Let's stop and ask if they need a ride." Mark grinned, always the adventurous one. "What's the worst that could happen? Maybe they have a good story to tell." Against Sarah's protests, I pulled the car to the side of the road, bringing the engine to a slow stop. The headlights illuminated the figure, casting a long shadow against the rocks behind it. For a moment, the figure didn't move, and the silence of the night seemed to deepen. Then, as if it had been waiting for us all along, the figure took a step forward, slowly emerging from the darkness. We watched, transfixed, as the figure approached the car. The movement was deliberate, almost unnatural. It seemed to glide rather than walk, its steps silent on the road. I rolled down the window, feeling a chill despite the warmth of the night. "Hey, are you okay?" I called out, my voice coming out shaky despite myself. "Do you need a ride?" The figure didn't answer right away. It merely stood there, closer now, its face still obscured by the wide-brimmed hat. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the faint sound of the ocean far below. Then, finally, it spoke. "Are you lost?" The voice was low and gravelly, almost inhuman, like it hadn't been used in years. I blinked, feeling a cold shiver run down my spine. There was something unsettling about the voice, something that felt wrong. I glanced at my friends, but none of us said anything. We all felt it, an overwhelming sense that something was not right. But I couldn't bring myself to drive off. Something kept me there, rooted to the spot. "No," I said, trying to force some normalcy into my voice. "We're just driving down the coast. Are you all right? Do you need help?" The figure didn't answer right away, instead tilting its head slightly, as if it was studying us, sizing us up. I glanced over at Sarah, and she looked pale, her hand clutching the seat in front of her. Mark was staring at the figure with wide eyes, and Laura had her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Without warning, the figure took another step forward, closer to the car. At that moment, the headlights of the Subaru flickered. The sudden darkness made my heart race. I reached for the ignition, but before I could start the car, the figure spoke again. "You're not supposed to be here," it said, its voice colder now, as if it was coming from a place far beyond the physical world. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my attempts to stay calm. The figure's head tilted further, its movements almost robotic, its body language stiff and unnatural. Then, without another word, it turned and began walking away, disappearing into the shadows of the cliffs. "No way," Mark muttered, his voice barely audible. "We need to go. Now." I didn't need any more convincing. My hands were shaking as I started the car. The engine roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas, pulling away from the dark figure standing on the side of the road. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, but the figure was no longer visible. For the next few miles, none of us spoke. The atmosphere inside the car had shifted entirely. What had started as a fun road trip had now taken on an ominous tone. The rest of the drive felt like a blur as we made our way down the highway, not stopping until we reached the next town, where we pulled into a small gas station to gather our thoughts. We all sat in silence, too shaken to speak, and the unnerving image of the figure stayed with us throughout the rest of the night. Even after we checked into a small motel, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us, something that had been waiting for us on that lonely stretch of highway. The air felt heavier, as if it was thick with the presence of something unseen. The next morning, we decided to do some research. We asked the motel owner if there had been any reports of strange occurrences in the area. She gave us a look, a kind of knowing look, before telling us about the legend of the shadow on the highway, a dark figure that appeared to travelers late at night, warning them to turn back. The locals spoke of it in hushed tones, telling stories of how it had appeared to people in the past, always before something terrible happened. There were no concrete details, no real explanation for who or what the figure was, but the stories were enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. We never saw the figure again, but we all agreed that something strange had happened that night. Whatever it was, it had left its mark on us, and we couldn't shake the feeling that it was always there, waiting, lurking in the dark corners of the highway, watching the travelers who dared to venture too far. The Hitchhiker in the Rearview Mirror, California Road Trip Horror. It was supposed to be a leisurely drive, a way to unwind from the chaos of everyday life. My best friend, Mark, and I had been planning this road trip for months. We had both recently graduated college and decided it was time for a break. A road trip down the California coast, from San Francisco all the way to San Diego, sounded like the perfect escape. We were looking forward to scenic views, great food, and the freedom of the open road. What we didn't expect, however, was the terrifying encounter that would change the course of our trip, and possibly our lives. Started like any other day. Mark and I packed the car with all our gear, snacks, water, camping equipment, and of course our music playlists for the road. We left San Francisco early in the morning, eager to get to our first destination, a small beach town south of Monterey. The weather was perfect, the sun shining brightly, and the gentle hum of the road beneath us created a peaceful atmosphere. We laughed and joked about our college days and what the future might hold, blissfully unaware of what lay ahead. About 3 hours into the drive, we found ourselves on a remote stretch of highway. The scenery had shifted from the hustle and bustle of city life to the quiet, sweeping views of the California coastline. The ocean stretched endlessly to our right, waves crashing against the jagged cliffs, while the road wound its way through dense forests and rocky hillsides. The air was fresh, filled with the scent of salt water, and the occasional gust of wind ruffled the leaves of the trees. It was the kind of drive you never wanted to end. That was when we first saw him. We were cruising along when we noticed a man standing at the side of the road, his thumb raised high, clearly hitchhiking. He was tall, thin, and wearing a weathered denim jacket. His face was partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, but we could make out the deep lines on his face, as though he had spent too many years out in the sun. He was standing alone, a lone figure against the backdrop of the vast, empty highway. Mark and I exchanged a glance. We'd both heard the warnings about picking up hitchhikers, especially on long stretches of remote road like this. But we also knew that the chances of encountering someone in need of help were rare. Mark, ever the optimist, was the first to speak. Maybe he's just lost or needs a ride to the next town. We're not in a hurry, and it's not like there's much traffic out here. I hesitated. Something about the man's stance seemed off, too still, almost like he was waiting for something. But Mark was already slowing the car down, pulling over to the side of the road. I looked at him with a mixture of doubt and curiosity. We had stopped for plenty of hitchhikers in the past, but there was something different about this one. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were about to make a mistake. As the car came to a halt, the hitchhiker stepped toward us with slow, deliberate movements. He didn't seem rushed or even eager to get into the car. He just approached, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of his hat, a strange smile playing at the corner of his lips. Mark rolled down the passenger side window. "Need a ride?" The man didn't immediately respond. Instead, he leaned down slightly, his face now partially visible. His eyes were dark, almost black, and they held a strange intensity. For a moment, I felt like I was staring into an abyss, like there was nothing behind those eyes, nothing human. "I'm trying to get to Big Sur," the man said in a voice that was hoarse, like it had been used too many times without rest. "Mind if I hitch a ride?" I could feel a chill creeping up my spine, but Mark was already nodding, unaffected. "Sure, hop in." The man didn't hesitate. He opened the door and climbed into the back seat, his movements strangely smooth, almost like he was gliding. He didn't thank us or say anything else as he settled in. The air in the car suddenly felt colder, though the outside temperature hadn't changed. We started driving again, the road stretching out before us. The silence in the car was palpable, uncomfortable. Mark and I exchanged a few glances, but neither of us knew what to say. The hitchhiker remained quiet, staring out the window, his face partly obscured by his hat. His presence was unsettling, like an invisible weight pressing down on the car. After a few miles, I couldn't take the silence any longer. "So, what's your name?" I asked, trying to break the tension. The man didn't turn to look at me, but his voice came from somewhere deep in the back seat. "I'm just passing through," he replied, his tone distant, as if he wasn't fully engaged in the conversation. "Heading south." I could feel my pulse quicken. There was something strange about the way he spoke. Like he wasn't really here with us, like he was talking to someone else or perhaps to himself. Mark tried to keep the mood light. Big Sur. Huh? That's a great place. We're heading that way too. The hitchhiker didn't acknowledge the comment. Instead, he continued to stare out the window, his hand resting on his knee. His posture was rigid, unnatural, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just sitting in the car. He was waiting for something. Waiting for us to make a wrong turn, maybe, or for something worse to happen. We drove in silence for what felt like hours, the road winding through dense forests and towering cliffs. The scenery was stunning, but I couldn't concentrate on it. My mind kept returning to the hitchhiker in the back seat. He hadn't moved, hadn't said a word. It was as though he was frozen in time, an eerie presence that filled the car with a sense of dread. Finally, we approached a small rest stop, a gas station that seemed to appear out of nowhere. We needed to stop for gas, and I was eager to get out of the car, away from the strange energy that the hitchhiker seemed to radiate. I pulled into the station and parked the car, hoping that the brief pause would relieve some of the tension that had built up. Without a word, the hitchhiker got out of the car, his movements once again smooth and calculated. He didn't even glance at us as he walked away, heading toward the small store. I watched him through the rearview mirror, my heart pounding. I wanted to ask him what he was doing, why he was acting so strange, but I didn't. Mark turned to me, his expression confused. What was that about? I don't know, I said, my voice tight. There's something wrong with that guy. We shouldn't have picked him up. We both sat in silence for a moment, our eyes locked on the hitchhiker as he disappeared inside the store. But then, just as quickly as he had arrived, he reappeared. He was holding something in his hand, something dark and unidentifiable. His face was still hidden beneath his hat, but now, his movements seemed even more erratic, as if he were in a hurry. Mark started the car, his foot pressing down on the accelerator. We need to go. Now. I nodded, and we pulled away from the gas station, watching the hitchhiker in the rearview mirror as we left him behind. But as we drove down the road, something strange happened. In the reflection of the mirror, I could still see the hitchhiker standing there, watching us. His figure was distorted, like a shadow in the glass, and his eyes seemed to burn with an unnatural intensity. I turned to Mark, my voice barely a whisper. Did you see that? Mark didn't answer, his hands tight on the wheel. I turned back to the rearview mirror, but the hitchhiker was gone. The road behind us was empty, the darkness of the night swallowing everything in its path. We didn't speak much for the rest of the drive. We drove in silence, the tension hanging thick in the air. But the memory of the hitchhiker stayed with me, haunting me long after the trip ended. I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just a stranger on the side of the road, that he was something far worse, something otherworldly, something that had been waiting for us all along. To this day, I can't help but wonder what would have happened if we hadn't picked him up. What if we had ignored the hitchhiker and kept driving? Would we have encountered something even worse? Or was it all just a strange coincidence? A trick of the mind? The answers remain a mystery, but the image of the man in the rearview mirror will forever be etched in my memory, a reminder that some things are better left unexplored. The deserted gas station, a California road trip horror. It was a late summer evening when my best friend, Jake, and I set off on our road trip through California. We were both in our early 20s, eager for adventure and looking for an escape from our hectic city lives. The plan was simple: drive down the highways of California, soak in the beauty of the desert landscapes, and discover hidden spots along the way. We didn't have any particular destination in mind. We just wanted to go where the road would take us. We were traveling along Interstate 10, a vast and lonely stretch of highway that cuts through the desert, connecting the southern part of California to the rest of the state. As we made our way through the dry, barren expanse, the heat of the desert sun beat down relentlessly. The air in the car was dry, the windows rolled down to let in the warm breeze. The The sky stretched endlessly above us, a pale blue canvas that seemed to go on forever. It was the kind of landscape that made you feel small, insignificant, as if you were just a tiny speck in the middle of an infinite nothingness. The drive had been peaceful, even meditative. We had passed through a few small towns, grabbed some snacks at roadside diners, and marveled at the surreal beauty of the desert. But as the sun began to set, a strange sense of unease began to creep in. The light grew dimmer, casting long shadows across the empty desert floor, and the landscape began to change. The sparse vegetation turned into vast stretches of dry, cracked earth, the occasional cactus standing like sentinels against the horizon. It was then that we saw it, the gas station. We had been driving for what seemed like hours without seeing another car or any signs of civilization. The road ahead stretched out like a ribbon of asphalt, disappearing into the darkening distance. The gas station appeared suddenly, almost out of nowhere, sitting on the edge of the highway like a forgotten relic from another time. It was old, the kind of place you'd expect to see in a Western movie, complete with a faded neon sign and a weathered, rusted pump. The lights flickered weakly, casting a dim glow over the area. "Do you think we should stop?" Jake asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. I glanced at the gas gauge and realized we were running low on fuel. The next town was still miles away, and there was no guarantee we would make it. The gas station seemed like our only option. "We don't have much of a choice," I replied, pulling the car off the highway and into the gravel parking lot. The tires crunched against the rough surface as we came to a stop next to one of the pumps. The place felt oddly deserted. The entire lot was empty, not a single car in sight. There was no one behind the counter, no sound except for the occasional gust of wind rustling through the desert brush. The air felt still, oppressive, as if the whole world had paused in time. I could almost hear my own heartbeat in the silence. Jake and I both got out of the car and walked toward the gas pump. As we did, I noticed something strange, the faint smell of something burning, almost like an old wood fire. I glanced around, but there was no smoke, no sign of a fire anywhere. The desert was eerily quiet, as though it were holding its breath. "I'll go inside and see if anyone's here," Jake said, heading toward the door of the small convenience store attached to the gas station. The door creaked as he pushed it open, disappearing inside. I stayed by the car, pumping the gas, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in my stomach. Minutes passed, and Jake still hadn't come back. I glanced at the door to the store, waiting for him to emerge, but there was no sign of him. My mind began to race. It wasn't like Jake to wander off, especially without saying anything. I called out to him, but my voice was swallowed up by the vast emptiness of the desert. I made my way toward the store, my steps slow and heavy, the weight of something unexplainable pressing on my chest. The door to the convenience store was still open, the creak of the hinges echoing in the stillness. I stepped inside, calling Jake's name. The store was dark, the fluorescent lights flickering above me. The shelves were mostly empty, covered in a thick layer of dust, as if no one had bothered to restock them in years. There were a few cans of old, rusted food, a couple of bottles of stale soda, and a refrigerator with a few forgotten bottles of water. But there was no sign of Jake. "Jake?" I called again, my voice more urgent now. Still no response. I walked further into the store, my footsteps echoing on the linoleum floor. The back door was slightly ajar, leading into what looked like a small storage room. I hesitated, but something told me I needed to check it. Slowly, I pushed the door open. The room was dark, the only light coming from a single bare bulb hanging overhead. It took my eyes a moment to adjust to the dimness, but when they did, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Jake was standing in the corner of the room, his back to me. He was facing the wall, his arms hanging limply at his sides. His body was rigid, his posture stiff, as if he had been frozen in place. His head was tilted downward, his face hidden from view by his messy hair. At first, I thought he was just looking at something, but then I saw it. The way his body trembled slightly, as if he was struggling to stay upright. "Jake?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "What's going on?" He didn't respond. He just stood there, motionless. I took a cautious step forward, my heart pounding in my chest. As I got closer, I could feel the temperature in the room drop. The air felt colder, heavier, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I reached out a hand to touch his shoulder, and as soon as my fingers made contact, he jerked violently, as if he had been startled awake. Jake spun around, his eyes wide and unblinking. There was something off about his expression. His pupils were dilated, his face pale and covered in sweat. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. He looked at me, but there was no recognition in his eyes. It was like he was seeing me for the first time. "Jake, what's going on?" I asked again, this time more forcefully. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he let out a strange, guttural sound, almost like a growl. His body trembled violently, and he staggered backward, as if trying to get away from me. "Jake, stop! What's happening?" I shouted, but he didn't answer. He just kept retreating, moving toward the far corner of the room, where an old door led into a small hallway. I felt a chill run through me, an instinctual fear telling me to get out of there. Without thinking, I grabbed Jake by the arm and yanked him away from the corner, pulling him toward the door. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. But as we made our way back into the main room of the gas station, something caught my eye, a shadow moving across the far wall. It was subtle at first, like a fleeting glimpse, but it was enough to make my stomach drop. The shadow didn't belong to us. It was something else, something that shouldn't have been there. I turned to Jake, but he was no longer with me. He had disappeared into the shadows of the store, his footsteps fading into the silence. I called his name one last time, but there was no answer. I was alone, standing in the deserted gas station with nothing but the fading light of the setting sun outside and the cold, unnerving presence of whatever had taken hold of Jake. I didn't know what had happened to him, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever was in that gas station was not of this world. It had claimed Jake, and it was waiting for me. In a panic, I rushed out of the store, hoping to find Jake. But when I stepped outside, the gas station was completely gone. The lot was empty, the neon sign flickering and dying in the dimming light. The desert stretched out before me, silent and still. I never saw Jake again, and I've never been able to explain what happened that night at the gas station. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that whatever took Jake is still out there, waiting for the next person to stop at that deserted station in the middle of the desert. Thank you all for listening to this story until the very end. Sleep well, and may you have sweet dreams. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next chilling tale. Good night.